Hey there, my friends. So you've heard all the news. Everybody's read the reports. CN, CP, the strike, what's happening, reducing all their services. And now we've actually got word, if you haven't heard, they've been deemed a non-essential service. So let's talk about that. We're also going to talk about some fuel pricing, and we might even dive into some lobster. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Logistics Life. Over the last couple of days, it's been a swamped time, so I apologize. We haven't got a show to you this week, but we never miss Data Day with Dean. Dean, how are you, buddy?
Good to be with you. Spent a bit of time your way on the weekend.
What's that?
Spent a bit of time up your way in Nova Scotia on the weekend.
Yes. So you know what? Why don't we start with the yummy part of it, so we can all get hungry before the end of the show here and talk a little bit about lobsters, because we were just talking off air for everybody watching and listening. Just in the amount of little pockets in this industry that there's so many dollars and cents flowing. It's insane. So share us a little bit about what you did in Nova Scotia and what you learned.
Yeah, so where I live in Boston, just north of Boston, I live near Gloucester, which is the oldest commercial seaport in the US. And I always see these seafood trucks in and out. Well, I see refrigerated trucks in and out. And I'm always curious as to what they're doing. Well, it turns out they bring a lot of fresh seafood in. It could be tuna, it could be halibut, but mostly lobster. But then they load back out of Gloucester, and what they load are bait fish. And sometimes it's herring, and they literally pump live herring in through a hose with water into the back of a refrigerated trailer. And the way they do it is they put a board up at the back with some fish crates to make a seal before they close the doors. They put the hose over the top of the board and the fish crates, and they fill the trailer full of bait fish and then haul back to Nova Scotia, usually around Bridgewater, south of Bridgewater down to Yarmouth. That's kind of where they call that the lobster capital of Canada. And then they'll reload and come back. And you can always tell the South Shore fish haulers, as they're called locally, they have triaxle trailers. And it's a pretty big spread. So it's a 12-foot spread triaxle on these magnificent trucks. They're just some of the nicest trucks you've ever seen. So they had a truck show in Bridgewater, the Brothers of the Highway truck show, and all the fish haulers were there. And these are some legendary fish haulers, Dan, from the 80s. Like, they're obviously not driving still, but there's some guys there in their 70s and 80s that hauled seafood in the good old days when they'd, load late in the afternoon with live lobster, catch the ferry across the Bay of Fundy to St. John, and then haul, all the way into Boston by sunrise. And there's some of the fastest trucks you've ever seen in your life. I saw them at the truck show. You could tell by the spec of these old trucks what they used to do.
They're beasts.
There's some legends. Like, I met Joey Hillman. Talking about local pockets of truckers. This is the South Shore truckers are a local group that have they're well known across the east coast of the US. And one of the more famous ones, I had a look at his 1976 cab-over Freightliner, and it fell through the pier at Boston one night, loaded with lobster at the Bay State Lobster Pier. There's pictures everywhere of this truck hanging over the pier through the concrete pier. Anyway, they just literally lifted it back out and put it back on its wheels, and the driver took off again, because you couldn't do that today, because there'd be all sorts of inquiries and, figuring out if the truck's roadworthy. Anyway, long story short, great show. We had a wonderful time meeting a bunch of people, had the Kevin Dennison band playing on Saturday night. There was so much history there. One of the guys has got a kind of a museum in a barn next to his house. There's such a tight-knit community. But the fish haulers, I got to run with them on the way back up 95 to the ferry. I caught the ferry across from St. John to Digby. The 3-hour boat ride was just fascinating. I drove my Peterbilt in behind all the reefer trucks after we'd slept that night. But just watching the sunrise over the Bay of Fundy with sort of Nova Scotia in the horizon. Dan also got at St. John, which of course is a big Irving port where they do all the oil refinery.
Yeah.
Which is not a bad segue to operating costs, because diesel was dropped for the 6th week in a row. But as we were leaving St. John, there's a big Saudi Arabia very large crude carrier there unloading, and they unload out in the ocean near land, but they have an unloading point that then gets pipelined to the Irving tanks on the headland, storage tanks, and then it goes to the big Irving refinery to be processed. And then as I'm there in the morning, this big crude carrier comes out loaded. It wasn't as big as a big crude carrier, and I thought, I've seen that ship before, and it's the Irving ship that runs processed distillates and fuel into Boston Harbor. Every time I go to the airport, I see this Irving boat, and I'm wondering, what the heck are you doing? And of course, it's at the port where all the tanker trucks load in Boston, downtown at Globe. It could be jet fuel, it could be diesel, it could be gasoline. I'm not sure. Yeah, but it's just interesting to see the whole supply chain. You've got crude oil from the Middle East coming into Irving, being processed, heading out. And so just St. John was a wonderful place, just seeing all the logistics. But the highlight really was the boat ride, because if you ever hung around truckers, you'll know that over time, the miles get faster, you do more of them, and the stories get bigger and more grand.
Yes. Yeah. Some of the stories, it was one thing I loved doing with our drivers is I loved sitting down with them. There was a husband-wife team that just seemed to come across so many cool things, and and I mean, Dean, the stories that you've told, especially offline, because I know you share a little bit more offline, but I mean, I'm constantly blown away by this industry, and it's, I think it's one of the only industries on the planet where it has this kind of dynamic. And you go back and you talk about how close-knit the community is. A couple of decades ago, that was the way everybody operated, and it's actually sad that it doesn't work that way now. I mean, don't get me wrong, you still have your community, but from the general aspect, right? I mean, I know we've talked many times where most trucks don't even have CBs anymore, and then you go back to the old school, days of the the big highway chains and all this kind of stuff, where people are just talking to each other, letting each other know what's happening on the road, like helping each other.
So Dan, it's interesting you say that, because all the way up into Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, all of the independent contractors, the professional owner operators, all have CB radios.
Yep.
Because we all talk to each other.
Yep.
But fleet drivers, no. There's a very different driver community out there today, and of course the newer drivers represent the majority. But there's a real camaraderie with the professional independents, and that's not age related. Like, you can be an independent contractor that's 30 years old and still and be part of that fabric. But the reason I say that is you can't get anybody to haul $1 million worth of live lobster from Yarmouth to Boston overnight. Because these are all night runners. Right now, this is a whole different deal to produce. This is night running, and you have to be in there because they're live. You've got them set at about 27 degrees. They're in. They stack these crates, 100-pound crates. They stack them as high as they can to the 45,000-pound limit. And these crates, though, they're not frozen, but they're live lobsters. And $1 million worth of lobster, you've really got to know what you're doing as a driver because these crates aren't tight against the walls. There's gaps. So some of them load to the left, some load to the right. The pros split them down the center and leave a gap in the center, which, and sometimes they wrap them with shrink wrap to stop them moving. But it takes a lot of skill to do this at speed at night. And that's why they drive the really nice trucks and make the big bucks, because it's a highly specialized part of our industry. And I'd never seen that, because I see the other end of the supply chain, which is fresh lobsters. We're paying, the boat gets paid about $9 a pound for lobsters. My wife's paying $50 a pound in Boston for retail. and a catering business. But in between all of that, there's this truck driver that's getting, paid really well. Now, the flip side is sometimes they have to go back empty, so there's no revenue if you're getting paid a percentage of the load. It's a long empty haul back unless you're loading bait fish out of Gloucester. So then, great weekend. But it's what makes trucking what it is today, because there are still pockets of carriers regionally that are like this. Next weekend, I'm going back up to the Tackerberry show in Athens, Ontario for the weekend with Mike Gaffin, the Boston trucker. And there'll be a whole nother Eastern Ontario / Quebec truckers there at that event. And they're all
When are you going up to Athens?
Be this Friday night, we'll get there.
Okay, let me look at what's going on.
It's the Tackerberry show. It's the Charlie Tackerberry and family own a gravel business. But Dan, he's got 300 trucks in his private collection in sheds. I have one. He's got 300. And he posts some of them on Facebook, and there's some classic trucks from years gone by. Just the most amazing collection you've ever seen. But 300 trucks, just process that. These trucks are priceless. You couldn't put a value on some of these trucks from the last century. I mean, they still run today.
Wow.
Oh, and before I go, there's also what they call 99 fleets, right, in Nova Scotia, which are the pre-ELD 1999 motors fleets that run fresh seafood. So, and people say, talk about ELDs a lot. Well, the older trucks actually have a lot of value these days, especially the 99 model engines who didn't have electronics.
Yes.
If you don't have electronics, you can't put an ELD on it. So that's why older trucks have so much value these days. And when you go to the shows, what you see are a lot of older trucks that have been completely rebuilt. So since ELDs came in, there's a whole aftermarket for repairing and rebuilding older trucks that can still haul freight regionally. Now, you're not running 48 states.
Yes, obviously, yes.
You can run Yarmouth, Boston with seafood a couple of times a week without any problem at all. Because then if something breaks, you're not too far away from home for the wrecker, right? You're not going to get stung with a cross-country haul. So that's just another little sort of side bit there. But it was fascinating to see these guys because they have fairly low operating costs with these older trucks. Their maintenance costs are a little bit higher, but these trucks have been paid for 10 times over. So it's very different economics.
Yeah. And when they repair them, it's a lot less technical, right? True. It's kind of like I mean, I got a buddy of mine specific. I mean, I got a few friends with older cars. Like we're up in the country, right? So I got a buddy that has a Barracuda in his shed, like in his barn,
right?
And it's gorgeous. Right. And other buddies with old GTOs and all this. And I got one buddy that actually has rebuilt a truck,
right?
And I mean, it's and I know it sounds crazy, but it's almost like a red-green duct tape scenario where if something goes wrong, it's like no, piece of bubble gum, a little MacGyverism, and you'll get back home no matter what, right? Whereas now I'll be driving and my truck's fairly new. It's a 2022, and all of a sudden all the dash will go out. And I'm like, okay, what? And it's like, and all these reboot, and then all these lights start flickering, and you're like, electronics, always great. The times I can't get my Apple headphones to connect to my Apple computer, but anyways, that's another show all on its own, brother. Yeah. So one big thing, and I think we should probably sooner than later address the elephant in the room here. Lot of conversations. I actually had a conversation yesterday with routers, picking my brain on what's happening with CNCP. Where officially, it was interesting because I actually got an email, first time ever, from LoadLink yesterday, talking about we've seen rates start skyrocketing because of the CNCP. Get on LoadLink, find your next load. So it was a very interesting email. But it's funny because I was waiting for this. Been monitoring this. Buddy of mine, Steve, told me about this probably 3 months ago, like 3.5 months ago. He says, Dan, it's coming, it's looming, just pay attention to it. And it first got put on my radar by Steve. Thanks, brother. And as watching this and then CNCP being deemed a non-essential service, I think
Mm.
blew me away.
That's
because
nuts.
we've had this conversation, and even when we had this conversation offline, for all of you that are still watching, Dean and I had this conversation a while ago offline, and my first comment to you, Dean, I don't know if you remember, it was I said the government always steps in. Like, we cannot let our two main rail lines, literally the heartbeat of Canada,
Right.
and the heartbeat of a lot of transition and transloading into the US via rail line.
Right.
We can't let them go on strike. Like, the government's always stepped in, and now deeming a non-essential service. Last week, sent you the report last week where they started degrading their service, meaning they stopped taking certain commodities, and one was hazmat right away, because you go on strike, you don't want to be housing that hazmat somewhere where, you know what I mean? So, right. So what are your thoughts on it? What have you seen? Have you seen any data to show rates changing?
A little bit. Something's starting to move. I went to Seattle. So Seattle, there's a lot of imports come into Seattle. And I looked at the Seattle, Ontario lane. So this could be part of it, Dan. Year over year, volumes of loads moved. So not load post. Volumes of loads moved between Seattle and Ontario are down 2% year over year, but they were up 45% last week. So here's the other side of it. Rates were flat. Rates were dead flat. So there's still plenty of capacity in the market. So what I'm seeing so far, based on data up until last Sunday, was there were volumes moving, but rates weren't moving so much on the inbound side into Canada, because there's still an excess of capacity in the market. And I looked at the other lane I looked at is outbound Ontario. And then this has got to do with the excess capacity that's in that market. Volumes are flat. So if you look at the total volume of loads moving out of Ontario, the Toronto market, which is the biggest spot market, those volumes are exactly the same as what they were this time last year, but they were up 30% last week. So volumes are flat compared to last year. Last week, they're up 30% in the week, but rates were down 2 cents a mile, because you've still got a lot of capacity outbound on the cross-border side. So I'm seeing some volume moving, but not the rate movement just yet. Now, LoadLink have probably got more recent data as of this week, because they'd have 3-day rates already on those lanes for the first 3 days of this week.
I know the Ontario market, obviously I have to, very well. What I see happening, and I think it's going to cause, for lack of a better term, a clusterfuck in the operation scenario. And what I mean by that is, I go back to my bed sheet customer, right? Called me the other day. He said, Dan, what happens if this happens? And I don't do very much business with him. I don't do any business with him anymore. But I still talk to him. It became unprofitable, right? So I had to drop it. And I told him, I said, Jeff, like, you're in trouble. So I don't know if you remember, but originally his margin per container was $7,000 after sales. Okay. Being beaten down by his customers and ocean freight rising. He's down to about $4,200. So he's lost almost half of his revenue per container, right? So he's obviously looking at different markets, blah, blah, blah. But one thing that he's concerned about is he's figured out, based on his volumes, based on his ocean door-to-door rate that he pays, he's in the neighborhood of somewhere, he figures, and I don't have any of his numbers anymore, so I'm going by what he's telling me, $1,800 from a container from BC to Toronto door.
Right.
Okay. So if you take that, and then you take the 6 grand that it's going for pre CNCP strike, he's literally just wiped out all of his profit, every single load he brings in. So one of the concerns he had, which I believe what's going to happen, is you're about to see a major increase regardless of capacity. I think you're going to see a major increase in prices, specifically going west to east. And the reason I say that is because there's only so much capacity in Ontario. if you start influxing Ontario, even Quebec, and even if you want to go back up and head over into, Manitoba or anything like that, you've got so many empty miles. You've got so many people competing. It's like 6-1 competing for outbound freight, right? It's going to get to a point where carriers are going to say, okay, yes, I'll take the load, but like I got nothing coming out of there. You're going to have to pay me. So they're going to want more to come in. It's like any market, right? You like when Houston dredged the port, and all of a sudden now they were able to take bigger tankers and bigger ships in. The rates going into Houston just plummeted because everybody wanted to get in there because people were paying an arm and a leg to get out of there because there was so much freight. And so it's, when I look at that, Dean, I think we've got a real storm coming. And
so what lane, when you say west to east, what lane would be?
So if you're looking at, for example, most of, obviously just like the US, the Canadian ports, the Western ports handle all, if not a vast majority of the Asia freight, right? So it's the west to east is going to be transloaded in BC and probably put on dry vans, flatbeds, whatever the case may be, whatever commodity, and trucked into Ontario.
Okay,
right?
So I've got Vancouver to Toronto dry van rates pulled up now.
Yep.
And at $1, so they are, if I include fuel, so they're sitting at $1.96 a mile. That's the highest in 12 months. It's 8 cents a mile higher than this time last year. It's up 6.16. It's up 18 cents in the last week on that lane.
There you go. Already happening.
So that's what's happening there. And I looked at Seattle. So we saw the same thing on Seattle. Seattle, Washington.
Now, one thing you'd also maybe want to look at is Seattle to BC, BC to Ontario, because a lot of BC carriers actually go to Seattle, pick up containers, bring them to BC, bring them back to Seattle as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So like depending, right? Like Delta Port or Intraport in BC, depending on those ports, depending on, what's happening in those ports, we've diverted freight to Seattle before it even became close to berthing. When we realized that, month end's coming, like, and this is another thing, right? Next week's month end, next week's, quarter end.
Labor Day holiday. Yep.
Labor Day holiday, quarter end's coming up, right? Like Q3, the end of Q3 is coming up. And here's the thing. It's not just what's happening now, Dean. It's the backlog of the cleanup after, right? It's like all these companies shifting their freight to an OTR market, right? Now, some might think, oh, well, they'll just shift to OTR. No, it's a completely different scenario. So you're now transloading containers instead of, so there's a cost for transloading. There's facilities. Who's going to transload? Who's going to cross dock? Who's going to transfer this freight? If it's hand bomb, who's going to palletize it and stack it? Like there's so many other layers of costs that I don't think a lot of people immediately upfront think about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Just before I answer that question, Toronto, Chicago is another big lane. 3-day rates are up 10 cents a mile in the last 3 days. So there's some movement there on that lane. But then the bigger thing, and this is why a lot of shippers have been pulling more volume in, because recall on last week's show, we talked about record July import volume.
Yes.
I mean, they are off the charts in Seattle. Like Seattle and Tacoma have just seen some of the highest monthly volumes ever in those ports as people have pulled forward more volume. And it's got a lot to do with the ILA strike, potential strike at the end of September on the eastern Gulf Coast. So that's one factor. To your point about disruption, the bigger factor, though, is the extra time it's taken because of the Red Sea crisis of ships to go around the Cape. That extra time has caused the dislocation of the movement of empty containers back to Asia, where there is a shortage of empty containers already. And you've seen vessel bunching. You're now starting to see a little bit more congestion. You had that refrigerated container blow up in was it Ningbo, the third largest port in the world?
Yeah.
So what you're starting to see are the signs of a significant disruption, because if this strike goes ahead, and that's not a given, according to some engineers that I talked to a locomotive engineer on the weekend at the truck show. He also drives trucks in his part-time gig, as well as a CN driver. He's adamant that CN will cave at the last minute because of the cost that this would represent to the company.
Oh, yeah.
So, but if it did go ahead, and you've already got signs of it, if people are already starting to move volume and transload containers, you've got potential for more containers to be disrupted.
Yep.
Well, this is really interesting. Tomorrow is the deadline for the.
Yes, I believe it's tomorrow. Yeah.
He texted me this morning. He said the lockout notice at CN and strike notice at lockout notice at CN and strike notice at CP have been served early Monday morning to take effect tomorrow night. So it'll be Thursday morning. So it'll be tonight at 1 minute past midnight tonight. Yep. Operations already scaling back. So here we are, less than 24 hours out, and that's what's happening. So he said it's the first time in 15 years locomotive engineers will be on strike, because normally the government sides with them as an essential service. But Dan, think about the impact on harvest season, grain season,
everything,
coal exports. It's insane.
Dean, I have an old customer I used to work with out west, and the amount of grain that this guy sends out is crazy. And he's like, no, they come, the rail car loads right here. We just, and it's done. Yep. And I mean, it's this is where I tend to stop and say, come on, everybody, like, get back to reality.
Right.
Why? Okay. Your locomotive friend, right, says they're going to cave at the last minute.
Right.
Now, my question becomes, and I know this is business, and there's and the majority of times, a lot of these things are people that are not on the ground level. They're sitting high up somewhere, and it's all about a piece of paper in front of them. I get that, right? I think we can all agree on that for the most part. Why would you even bother? Because I would like to see how many millions they've lost in revenue just in the last 2 weeks, even 3 weeks, by people preparing and canceling orders, because it's not just right now. It's stuff that's on a ship right now coming that's due in 2 weeks, where customers have already said, you're not railing it, I'm trucking it, I'm not leaving it to chance. Because I think a lot of companies have realized what happens when they leave things to chance and aren't proactive. Sometimes they're wrong, meaning the strike could end and they'd have to, reverse the work, but being proactive to get their product to market, to get it sold. Because the last thing you want is product tied up somewhere because somebody's on strike. Because then if they do go on strike, the trucks trying to get into the yards, time of hell. Trying to get out, time of hell. The delays, all this kind of, there's this huge like aftershock wave from a nuclear bomb going off in the ocean kind of thing.
Again, that's why you're seeing a lot of people pull forward that volume, because they were worried about this. There was rumblings about this a long time ago, more so the East Coast ILA strike. But the drop dead deadline was last week to have your imports from Asia here before retail season. 8/15 was the date. If you were ordering freight to be imported after 8/15, you're going to have really big difficulties trying to get it landed into a warehouse and into a retail store. So we're already in that peak season where people are, that's why they've been bringing this volume forward. But for those that have still got volume on the water, this is a potentially big deal for them in terms of disruption of their inventories for the retail season, these last minute inventories. My contact said estimate 20 to 30 million losses a day, Canadian, from the strike.
Like, why would you, this is what I don't get, Dee. As a corporation, okay, I mean, I don't know what their payroll is, and I don't, you know what I mean? I get that, but why would you even bother? In the end, you're going to cave, right? Because what are you going to do? You're going to do 100 million a week in losses, and just to like, show whose ego's bigger. I don't know. I don't know. And maybe I'm totally off topic here, or off the mark here, Dean, but I don't get it. It's like, if this is something that happens all the time, all the time, all these industries, regardless of what it is, ports, longshoremen, like whatever it is, we're going to go on strike, and then everyone caves. Like,
if you look at the strength of unions in the last couple of years, you've had the potential rail strike here, you had the West Coast port workers, labor agreement. We've got an election year in the US here, so the unions, the Teamsters union were at the DNC last night on stage. The UAW's come out supporting the Biden administration. Like, it's become very political.
Yes.
And they've had some pretty big wins. But I think in the background, workers are also feeling the pressure, so they feel entitled to some pay rises because corporate profits are pretty good. When you look at all the earnings reports, people are making money, especially through sort of the inflationary impact of food costs and some price gouging that's clearly been going on. So I think workers feel a little bit entitled to their share. So you're probably right, Dan. It's a little bit of posturing. It's a bit of saber rattling. We're seeing that on the East Coast with the port workers talking about a 70% pay rise, 70% pay rise. Right now, that wasn't dissimilar to what they were talking about on the West Coast when they were saying, "Hey, the shipping lines made billions during the pandemic. We want some of that."
Yep.
So that's kind of the attitude here. So you could see the adversarial discussions in the boardroom, assuming they're going on. That being sort of one of the common threads.
And you know what, Dean? If everybody operated, and I know for everybody, when I say this, I know everybody goes, "Come on, Dan, this is," if you leave something for somebody else, leave a little something for somebody else on the table.
Yeah.
You never have these issues. And I'm sorry, I will argue this till I'm 6 feet deep.
Yep.
Like if you give to everyone, in the end, you win.
Well, it's got to present value. Whatever you're selling, it's got to present a bit of value. If you're selling something, it's got to have a little bit of value left in it for the other person to make a gain. Yeah. You can't just maximize on the way up and the way down. Like, it just doesn't work that way.
Yep, exactly. So what do you, we've got fuel dropping.
Yep.
We've got rates in certain areas rising.
Yep.
Hopefully we'll have numbers with inbound and outbound, CVORs and operating authorities. What do you see? Do you see anything changing from some of the predictions we talked about a couple of weeks ago? No. Okay. So even something like this, we don't see it changing long term. It won't really flip a switch.
Won't move the national needle, Dan. It'll move some needles. It'll move the needle on some lanes, like we just discovered. But the national needle, no. This isn't the demand shock that will flip the market, especially in the North American market, because of what I've termed latent capacity. Right. So this is a very unusual down market. We're at 28 months of negative year-over-year rates. They're just clawing their way back into positive territory after 27 months. So they're still fairly low. But we talked about this a number of times on the show. A lot of carriers paid down a lot of debt. They own their own trucks. They can run for 30 cents a mile less than a truck that's financed. They can run for $1.50 a mile with line haul rates excluding fuel around $1.60. They can still pay themselves $60,000 a year. Now, what's happened this time around is, and by a latent capacity, I mean there's a lot more carriers this cycle who can afford to sit out a day or a week because they own their own truck and trailer. They paid it off during the pandemic. I can't quantify how many, but I'm sure there is a big number of carriers, what I call in that latent capacity, that are opportunistic. They come into the market and go out of the market when it suits them. And they're like the Landstar non-force dispatch owner-operator who works 6 months on, 6 off, works 3, have 3 off. When you own your own equipment and you're a good operator, you can pick and choose when and where to run and for how much. And so what we've got is this latent capacity that's going to keep coming in and out of the market that'll keep spot rates flat for the rest of the year. That's what we've got going on right now, because there's no demand trigger that's going to flip this market from where it is. Like, there's nothing happening on the manufacturing front or the import front or hurricanes that's really going to change market dynamics. Markets don't flip because capacity leaves, and capacity is still leaving, but capacity is still joining also. So it's not like we've got a net loss of carriers anymore. In fact, in the spot market, where 90% of the carriers have less than 4 trucks that enter and exit the market each month, that's back to break even and slightly growing now after being negative territory since October 2022. So there are signs the market is bottoming out and starting to rates are starting to increase nationally, but this is a really slow change in a market cycle. This will be one of the longest on record, I think, in terms of how long we were at the bottom. I think we're going to be at the bottom of this market cycle for 6 to 9 months without any doubt.
So do you see it then, I guess, do we see, let me rephrase this. So what I'm starting to think is, originally I was very hopeful that we would have something change the market, as much as I don't wish ill on anything like a hurricane or anything like that. I thought there was going to be I honestly thought there was going to be something that shifted the market, because there usually is. But now I'm starting to have the perspective, and I'd love your thoughts on it, that probably for another 12 months, I'm going to think somewhere in that neighborhood, I think it's going to be departmental or pocketized geographicality of specific areas that change, right? So remember, we were talking a couple of weeks about Illinois up into Sudbury and all the steel going up there and what's happening, right? We're seeing a slowdown of that because it was kind of like almost like project work, if I can position it like that, right? Where there's a certain amount of time where things excel and then maybe they'll decelerate as well, right? And part of me thinks the market this is what the market's going to be. And it might transition into this is what the market is from here on out. I honestly think there's, kind of like, how do I put it? And I don't mean to be, too dramatic or anything, but life before COVID and life after COVID, right? There's people's whose lives have changed forever from the pandemic. And I mean, I still to this day see people with masks. And I remember I was at Walmart the other day and I saw somebody with a mask, and something came over me, and I just stopped. I said, "Can I ask you a question?" They said, "Yeah." I said, "Is there a reason you're like?" I said, "No ill on it. I'm curious. I'm genuinely curious. Is there a reason you still wear a mask?" And this guy said, "I am terrified to step out in public without it."
Wow.
And I was like, interesting. So I believe it changed people for,
well, especially pre-existing conditions, right? If you're not of excellent health, you could see that. If I saw it in the airport, seen it in the airport last week, even traveling overseas, there's still a cohort of people that wear masks. Yeah.
And I think, and maybe it's not the pandemic, maybe it's well, I think it's probably the majority of the pandemic, because shippers had to get smarter shipping their freight, right? They have to start paying attention to markets. They have to start understanding this. And I'm part of me says, and it'd be interesting to see how this plays out, but part of me says we're in for possibly a new dynamic in the entire freight and supply chain world. Right. The pandemic, in my opinion, rushed in AI. I think it rushed in a lot of things. Now, I think that AI bubble is kind of cooling now. I do a lot of research on AI, and we're seeing a lot of the cooling in the bubbles. But I do believe AI is actually going to take jobs in our industry in the next coming 6 to 12 months. I know it's going to happen, because there's just certain pieces of the puzzle, right? Like we look at, one big thing in our world, it's brokerage companies, right? The amount of brokerage companies that are looking to sell these big facilities because they know they don't need these huge offices. People can work from home. Like all of these dynamics, I think, are truly changing in our industry. And I think it's, if we don't adapt and change with them, we're going to get left behind. Right. And it'd be interesting. I think I'm going to start tracking this more. What are your thoughts about all that?
I think it's definitely going to change everybody's lives. I think I see some industries probably more affected than others. I worry about even my job, right, as a freight market analyst, because here's the challenge. If you type in, write a freight market update like Dean Croak does, it'll come out 85, 90% how I'd write it. Now, what it lacks is today's data about movement of rates between Toronto and Chicago, that sort of stuff. And that's what you've got to keep proprietary. So what companies are trying to do now is figure out, how do we protect what we've got without giving too much IP out that the algorithms can learn from, right? So I worry about, because you could easily push out blog post content daily without someone like me. You could just push out crap. Right, it would be meaningless, bland. But for someone new to the industry, it'd be educational. It's pulling from everything that's been written. But if you want real, meaningful insights, then that's a whole different ball game. So I think about it a lot. I think about it for my kids' generations. I think people in services are probably a little bit more protected, because that's more physical. The physical services, plumbers, electricians, caterers. right?
Yeah,
Those
yeah.
sorts of industries. But think about paralegals and people that, have to go and research lots of documents for court cases. Like, if it's out there in the public domain, the algorithm can go and find it in a nanosecond and write the report for you.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I could automate 99.9% of the things that most people do.
Right.
I've been studying it for months now, and I'm becoming very good at it.
Right.
And Dean, you're absolutely right. I could take 10 blog posts that you've wrote,
Right.
and I can create a prompting chain that would literally pump out an article that, if you did not know I did it,
Right.
anyone reading it would probably say, "Oh, Dean wrote that 2 months ago."
Yeah.
Not to date, but then you can take an API from your system, if you have it, and you can triangulate that API to pull specific data, add that data, push one button, and then take you 10 minutes to edit a post instead of hours to write it.
Right.
And this is what's happening already.
So then it's interesting. I see it helping, right? Because I grew up with Australian English, so grammar is not my best thing that I'm good at, especially in America, because the words are very different, and so is the punctuation and the spelling of, liter and liter are spelt very differently between the two countries.
Yes.
Center, one's RE, one's ER. Tire is IRE versus TYRE. Like I said, there's a whole lot of stuff that I get wrong all the time. But what I find is when I take my text and drop it into Grammarly, it helps me with my my grammar, obviously.
Yep.
But then I hit this button that says generative AI, and it says, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Make it better." I click that button, and it rewrites the whole thing. And then most of the time, it actually comes out a little bit better than how I would have written, because we've all got our own styles. So the challenge becomes that if you constantly do that, your style changes as people see it, not how you write it. So sometimes I think maybe my style is actually better, but sometimes it picks up grammar problems and different words, in a way that I would never have thought of. One of the best journalists I know is John Kingston from Freight Waves. He writes about the oil markets. Incredibly good journalist. How he writes so well. It's so engaging. You just want to keep reading, and that's a real skill. So that's constantly what I'm trying to do, is use AI to help me write better. Is that the way to describe this?
You write better. I would have said that for sure. Well, you know me, I say all that stuff all the time. It's interesting, Dean. I use Grammarly, and I've been using it for ages, right? Because I'm the same way. My punctuation sucks. I type so fast that I just have to get it out of my head and then on paper, and then I go back and edit it. I just got an email yesterday from Grammarly. I've edited 8,896,000 words in like 3 years.
Right.
And I'm like, holy crap, I didn't realize I wrote that much. Like, if you start breaking that down, right, that's like, almost 3 million words a year.
Right.
I'm thinking, how do I write that much? But it's like, it's on everything, right? Because I got all the extensions. So everything I write in, Grammarly is there to help me. I like it. But then when I start using this, and for all of you listening to the podcast, this is a pen, right? It's something we write with that's non-digital. It's like, I sometimes stop and go, how's that word spelled again? And center, it's funny you brought up center, because center's one of them. I'm like, geez, is ER the Canadian way, or is RE the Canadian way? I'm like, it just blows my mind.
Well, Dan, as we get older and become more dependent, I find it really hard to write cursive anymore, because I'm constantly typing. And because of spell check, right, I go to fill in my logbook in my truck, and I find it really hard to write anymore. And because I just don't write. I don't write letters, don't write postcards. I think it's the same with typing and words and Grammarly. Our brain gets used to spell check, fixing stuff up. You can just bang out 100 words and spell check, or you go back and just correct everything automatically.
I can't tell you how many people I speak to now, and I've been saying this is what's going to happen. It's kind of like putting the reverse cameras in cars. Right. People that have reverse cameras, I'm like, do you ever use your mirrors? No, I got a reverse camera. It's a new, and I make it a point to still use my mirrors, because it's the way we grew up driving, but it's also, in my opinion, it's so important because I mean, and don't get me wrong, you know, like when we were growing up, there was no sensors on the car. We didn't know you only knew you were too close when all of a sudden you heard bump and you're like, all right, well, I just bumped their bumper. You know what I mean? But it's all of these things I think are great in one aspect, but they're horrible in another. When my wife worked at a bank, she said, honey, you don't understand how many people come in and have no idea how to sign their own name.
Yeah.
Because we don't get taught cursive in school. And I think, and I mean, I'm a full transparency. I print.
Right. Yeah.
I don't write cursive. I never have. My cursive is messy as hell. I'm kind of like one of those doctors that write cursive where you can't read a damn thing. Yeah. I print everything. Like everything I do is printed. And it's just the way I work. Most of my things, I don't think I've ever written a small R. All M's are capitalized. So like I have, you know, like outline right here, idea, O-U-T, and then the line L is capitalized, and then the N's capitalized, and the E's capitalized. And it's just the way I write.
Well, think about vehicle design, Dan, right? So you're talking about backup cameras. So here's the question. We've got a lot of truck drivers out there that can't reverse, can't drive, don't look in mirrors, very disconnected from the driving task, but they have all this technology around them to protect them.
Yes.
Adaptive cruise, lane departure, collision warning, right? So my question to you is, have we dumbed down the driving task by adding more technology to support, drivers, or have drivers just naturally become worse and we've had to invent this technology to help them be safer? What came first? Because here's my theory. I think what we've done is we've invented all of this technology because we think it's going to help people. And what it's done, it's allowed us to dumb down our skills.
Yes.
Right? We don't need the skills anymore to drive a truck as like we used to, because you've got this safety net of technology around you. So over time, what you end up with is a lower standard of driver, because you don't need to be like me, who grew up driving by sound and smell and feel. You've got all this technology around you telling you everything you need to know. It's a totally different driving task. So I wonder whether that's what's really going on here, is that we're actually got technology for technology's sake driving the change, as opposed to the human brain changing.
So I think it's both. And here's what I believe initiated it was safety. I believe the initial desire was to have safer roads, right? The initial desire was to put all these safety things in check, to maybe mitigate insurance. I remember speaking to an OPP officer, and it was a couple of years ago. I went to the car show in Toronto, and there was a Model X with that was decked out like an OPP cruiser, right? Like or SUV, whatever. And I remember talking to the guy because I just got, we're going back to 2017. Sorry. I just got my Fusion Energy, and it was a plug-in hybrid, but it was the first time I had adaptive cruise control, lane departure warning, lane departure keep, and all that. So in essence, it wasn't an autopilot, but it was pretty much an autopilot. I was able to keep one finger on the steering wheel, check my email while driving to work, and my car would stop, start, move. It's not like, it wasn't like a Tesla where it would actually, you could do S curves. But the highway that I ran, it was a slight curve, you know what I mean? So the car would actually stay in the lanes. And I remember asking the officer, I said, so let me ask you, let me ask you this. I said, when it comes to accidents now, has all this cruise control and autopilot changed the dynamics? He goes, oh, yeah. He goes, we literally, when we get on a scene, unless it's so blatantly obvious whose fault it is, we have to download the data from the vehicles. Oh, wow. He goes, so we can't even on scene arrest somebody or unless it's obvious, and there is certain points where it's obvious. He goes, like, we can't tell. He goes, I can't tell you how many times I've been to scenes where there's no brake marks, like no skid marks. And he goes, and what that tells us immediately is this person's not paying attention. And he says the technology in the cars has allowed us to pay less attention to what we're doing, has allowed us to become more ADD as a society than anything. And I was blown away, and I was like, Oh my gosh. And that was actually the first time
Right.
I realized that tech
Yep.
could be a real issue in our world, Dean.
Right.
Like it really could, because it's pulling the human element out of everything. Like when you drive, you know your brakes are going by the squishiness of your brakes.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
It's like, if you know, like I think for me, I know I don't even have to look at my kilometers. I know it's time for an oil change when I start burning more fuel.
Yeah.
Right. I don't have to look at the 50% oil, And it's interesting because I remember asking my daughter one day, she needed an oil change on her car. She goes, I need an oil change on my car. I said, okay, well, go get it. I said, how long have you had it? She goes, I don't know. I got 10% oil left. I go, 10% oil. I go, honey, like you have sludge in your car. And it's just, but when we were growing up, it was like you had to understand this, right? So you had to pay attention to the signs.
Right.
And the signs are, when you start realizing you're burning more fuel, it's probably time for an oil change if you're not monitoring your kilometers, because the engine's not running as smooth as it should. It's working a little harder, right? When we're reversing, we got that ability to understand where the back of our car was from the mirrors, right?
Yep.
And I don't know, I see it in both ways. I see us becoming, and to go back to your point with drivers, I think originally it came out for safety reasons. Originally it came out maybe as vehicle companies like Volvos, the Freightliners, and all that. When you get our vehicles, we're safer than the other vehicle because we have this technology, and it maybe was more of a higher feature advantage benefit, an FAB to sell a vehicle, right? But I think what it's done arbitrarily, and the flip side of it, because you can't have an up without a down, you wouldn't know a good paycheck if you ever got a bad paycheck. You never know a good day unless you had a bad day. It's made us dumber on the roads. And I think you see that with things like I'll be on a 400 series highway, and this truck will be way too close to this car. And I'm like, okay, this person obviously has no idea what happens if there's a break. And in Ontario, for all of you that have driven in Ontario, you can come to a complete stop on a major highway, and then all of a sudden you go again, and you never see an accident or anything. It's just like somebody had a brain fart, they slowed down, and 150 cars later, everyone's stopped.
I think it's safety, but it's also attorneys and the legal system trying to develop electronic fingerprint to figure out what happened as a way to defend yourself. That's how ELDs came along back in 2007.
Well, and dash cams.
Yeah, people were already putting in ELDs to defend themselves against the claim that your driver was asleep. So no, we were compliant to the hours of service regulation, down sand. And then of course you had the dash cams come in. One of the very early companies that put dash cams in were motor coach companies. I was working with companies at the time, and it wasn't the ejection, it was the slip, trip, and fall, the fake slip, trip, and fall. Oh, the driver slammed the brakes on and I fell over. Well, I'm sorry, the camera says otherwise. So a lot of it had to do with soft tissue fraud and the need for inwards, outwards cameras. And that's where it started. It worked its way over to trucks over time, because it came a good way. And of course, no owner operator now would run without a dash cam because of all the crazy stuff that goes on, to your point about people being disconnected from the driving task because they've got a safety net around them now, a technology safety net.
Well, and it's everyone else around them as well too. Right? Like I remember when we had an owner operator team going down the highway, and it was, midnight or something. Maybe it was 1 o'clock in the morning, and this car came onto the on-ramp onto the highway. And it cut across 4 lanes and just happened to go right under the back of the tractor wheels, the trailer wheels. Bang. And ended up dying. Well, it ended up being a politician's son. And this was like, and the first thing is logbooks. Where are you supposed to be here? Right. So I see that from a safety perspective. I do. And I think because of that, and I think, you look at cars, you look at sensor warnings, you're going to hit this, because again, insurance companies didn't want to pay out claim. You know what I mean? There's all these different things. And I think, and I do believe, Dean, there's a huge benefit to it. Like I look at my truck, right? Ford has Pro Trailer Assist, where you can literally turn your trailer on a dial, and it's as if you're playing a video game. So you actually, if you want the trailer to go one way, you turn it the way you want the trailer, as opposed to actually backing a trailer up. It's reverse, right? So it's allowed people that don't know how to back up trailers to be safer.
Right.
It's kind of become a game, so it's being gamified in every way. I believe that technology is going to hit trucks very shortly. If not, it's already in.
It does on the wind farm, the blades, like the big 200-foot blades. The escort vehicle behind has got the controller that's driving the back trailer, steering
there you
the
go.
corners.
So it's you look at that aspect of it, and I say, okay, this is a good thing, because it can now, like, and I look at it, for me, I look at it more as like my snowmobiling, right? We now have people that might not be really good at hauling trailers able to get into snowmobiling or quadding, where they have to take their tools on the road. Right. I think it's a good thing, but I also think it's a bad thing, because you don't really know how to back up a trailer. If that technology breaks, you're up Schitt's Creek without a paddle. And I don't know. So I mean, it's, and I think everybody's going to have a different argument about when it comes to actual safety and all this, and the electronics and the computer systems that are involved, right? But crazy what we're getting into, buddy. Crazy.
It is
Unreal.